Sometimes the most extraordinary talent hides in the most unexpected places. In a crowded concert hall, a blind boy was asked to play the piano, just for fun. But when his fingers touched the keys, the world stood still. This is the story of a gift that changed everything. Under the golden lights of Carnegie Hall, the great chandeliers glowed as if they were preparing for royalty. Rows of velvet seats stood empty, waiting for tomorrow's charity concert that would bring New York's elite together. On stage, Ethan Caldwell sat at the grand piano, fingers gliding across the polished ivory keys with calculated grace. Each note struck the air like a declaration of his genius, and he knew it. Ethan was not just a pianist. He was the pianist, a man whose name carried weight across Europe and America. Yet, with every note, his face carried not joy but a smirk of superiority, as if daring anyone to question his mastery. He was a man who believed music belonged only to those born with pedigree, training, and prestige. At the back of the hall, Grace Reed quietly pushed a mop bucket across the polished floors. She was a cleaning staff member, invisible to most, though her presence kept the grand hall spotless. Beside her walked Marcus, her 12-year-old son, holding lightly onto her arm. His eyes, clouded by blindness since birth, shifted toward the stage as if drawn by an unseen magnet. Grace had no choice but to bring him. Childcare was a luxury she couldn't afford, and her shift was long. Marcus never complained. He only listened. Music was his escape, though his mother never fully grasped just how deeply it lived inside him. Ethan struck the final chord of his rehearsal piece, the sound echoing like a curtain closing. He stood, brushing his hands on his suit jacket, when he noticed the boy standing near the stage's edge. The boy's face was turned toward the piano with an expression of awe. At first, Ethan frowned at the distraction. Then, curiosity mixed with arrogance painted his expression. "Well," he said loudly, so his words carried across the hall, "it seems we have a little admirer." The few staff members nearby chuckled softly. Grace froze, embarrassed, tugging Marcus's arm. "I'm sorry, sir. He didn't mean to disturb," she began, but Marcus gently pulled away, still facing the sound of the piano. His small hand reached out, brushing against the air until his fingertips met the glossy wooden frame of the instrument. He touched it as if it were alive. Ethan raised a brow, amused by the boldness. "Go ahead," Ethan said, his voice smooth but edged with mockery. "Play something, just for fun." His words hung in the air, half a challenge, half a joke. The orchestra members setting their instruments in the background snickered, exchanging glances. What could a blind boy do with a Steinway that took Ethan himself decades to conquer? Grace's face flushed. "Sir, please, he doesn't—" She tried again, but Marcus tilted his head toward Ethan's voice. "May I?" Marcus asked softly. His voice was calm, almost too calm for a child. Ethan leaned back, folding his arms. "By all means. The piano is yours, if you think you can manage." The laughter grew louder. A stagehand muttered, "This ought to be good," while Daniel Harper, the stern concert organizer, appeared from the side, frowning. "Ethan, we don't have time for this circus. The donors—" But Ethan waved him off, entertained by the thought of the boy fumbling at the keys. Marcus lowered himself slowly onto the bench, his small frame nearly swallowed by the size of the instrument. His hands trembled for a moment, as they hovered above the keys. The hall, which had moments ago been filled with laughter, began to quiet. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the odd seriousness in Marcus's posture. Even Ethan, leaning against the piano with folded arms, felt a strange pause in the air. Grace stood frozen, clutching her mop, her heart pounding. She wanted to pull him away, shield him from ridicule. But something in her son's face stopped her. His closed eyes, though blind, seemed lit with something unexplainable, like he wasn't about to press keys, but about to speak. Marcus inhaled deeply. His small fingers floated an inch above the ivory, waiting. The chatter faded. Footsteps. Stilled, even Daniel Harper's protest died in his throat. The grand hall, usually so alive with rehearsal and chatter, was suddenly wrapped in silence. Every person present leaned forward, waiting for the inevitable clumsy noise of a child who dared sit at a master's throne. And then, in that silence, his fingers hovered, just long enough to make the entire hall hold its breath. The first note. Marcus' struck did not stumble, nor did it hesitate. It rang pure and clear, blooming into the vastness of Carnegie Hall as if the instrument had been waiting for his touch all along. His small fingers glided across the keys, not in chaos, but in a language so precise and natural it silenced every chuckle in the room. The laughter that had filled the air just seconds before evaporated into stillness. Marcus played with a confidence that defied his age, weaving melodies as though he had lived 1,000 lifetimes through music. Each phrase carried depth, sorrow, joy, and something no conservatory could ever teach. Soul. Ethan Caldwell, the man who believed no one could touch his throne, stood frozen. His sharp eyes followed every movement of Marcus's hands. What he heard was not mimicry. It was not random fumbling. It was mastery. The boy's fingering mirrored techniques Ethan had taken years to develop. The arpeggios rolled like waves, crescendos swelled and broke with breathtaking control. Even the pauses, the silences between the notes, were deliberate, filled with weight and emotion. Ethan's pride, his arrogance, wavered as a cold realization struck him. This blind child was not simply playing the piano. He was commanding it. Grace stood near the mop bucket, her lips parted in disbelief. Her son's small body swayed slightly with the rhythm, eyes closed, head tilted toward the vibrations of the strings. She had always known Marcus loved music. He would hum tunes, after hearing them once on the radio, sometimes even tapping out rhythms on their kitchen table. But this was different. This was genius, unfolding before her eyes. Tears welled in her as she whispered, "My God, Marcus." The audience of staff, musicians, and workers listened with stunned reverence. The notes filled the empty hall as though it were already packed with thousands. Marcus, who had never owned a piano, who had never seen the light of a single day, was painting with sound as if the universe had whispered its secrets directly into his ears. As the melody swirled, the story of his life unfolded in the music. Flashbacks of Marcus's childhood seemed to breathe within each note. A boy sitting on the edge of a busy street, listening to an old saxophonist playing for coins. A blind child crouched near a subway platform, memorizing the echo of a violinist's song. A kitchen where his mother sang to keep his spirits alive, and Marcus tapped the tune against the counter, repeating every pitch perfectly. He had been gathering music his whole life like a sponge, absorbing it through every sound around him. Now, it all poured out in a tidal wave of beauty that no one could stop. Daniel Harper, the organizer, scowled from the side of the hall. He crossed his arms and muttered, "It's just a parlor trick. The novelty of a blind boy pressing keys, nothing more." His voice, though low, carried enough venom to sting. He could not afford distractions or risks before the charity gala. To him, talent mattered less than reputation, and Marcus did not fit the picture of refinement he wanted for the stage. But Ethan did not answer. He couldn't. His throat was tight as he watched his own certainty unravel note by note. Pride and admiration collided inside him, leaving him torn between envy and awe. For the first time in decades, Ethan felt something stir that he had long buried, a spark of inspiration, the kind he thought he'd lost to ego and endless tours. He was listening not just to a child's gift, but to the future of music itself. Marcus, unaware of the storm he had created, reached the end of his piece. But instead of stopping, his fingers wandered into something new, an improvised melody. raw and unplanned. It was fragile yet powerful, weaving classical structure with street-born rhythm. The sound was unlike anything anyone had heard before, not bound by tradition or expectation. It was Marcus's voice, pure and unfiltered. The final chord rang out and lingered in the silence, vibrating through the hall, through the bones of every person present. No one moved, no one breathed. Even Daniel's protests faltered on his lips. Slowly, Marcus lifted his hands from the keys, folding them in his lap. His head turned slightly as if waiting for laughter, for dismissal. But none came. Ethan took a step forward, his eyes locked on the boy. For once, his face carried no arrogance, only gravity. He lowered his voice, though the entire hall heard him. "Marcus," he said, pausing as though weighing the weight of his words, "how would you like to play on this stage? Not for fun, but for real." From the moment the last note faded in Carnegie Hall, Ethan Caldwell knew his life had shifted. The arrogance that once shielded him now cracked, leaving room for something he had not felt in years: purpose. He approached Marcus with a promise that he would teach him, guide him, prepare him for a stage the boy had never imagined. Grace hesitated, clutching her son's shoulder protectively. She had spent years shielding him from cruelty, and the idea of placing Marcus in the center of a ruthless world of critics terrified her. Yet in Ethan's voice there was an urgency, not of vanity, but of recognition, as though he had glimpsed something sacred and refused to let it be wasted. Reluctantly, she agreed, though her eyes never lost their suspicion. The days that followed became a whirlwind. Ethan took Marcus under his wing, bringing him to the hall during rehearsals, then into his private studio. He sat beside him, correcting his posture, guiding his hands, pushing him to move beyond instinct into discipline. Marcus soaked it in with an eagerness that startled Ethan. He could memorize a scale after hearing it once, repeat complex passages. Without hesitation, and even when he faltered, his persistence never wavered. Yet the lessons were not one-sided. Marcus, in his innocence, reminded Ethan of something the maestro had long forgotten: that music was not a contest, not a crown, to be worn, but a voice of the heart. Ethan found himself humbled by the boy's purity, even as he drilled him with the rigor of a soldier. But not everyone welcomed this new partnership. Daniel Harper stormed into board meetings, his voice sharp with disapproval. "We cannot gamble the reputation of Carnegie Hall on a charity stunt," he barked at the donors, his words dripping with disdain. "A blind street boy on stage? Our patrons expect refinement, not pity performances." Many donors nodded, whispering their doubts. They spoke of image, of money, of expectations. To them, Marcus was not a prodigy but a liability. Ethan fought back, insisting Marcus's gift was undeniable, but each argument only deepened the divide. Newspapers caught wind of the controversy. Tabloids splashed headlines mocking Ethan. "Caldwell loses his mind, puts blind boy in spotlight." The maestro, who once walked untouchable through the city, now felt the sting of ridicule. Grace watched all of this with unease. She admired Ethan's dedication, but mistrust lingered in her heart. Was he using Marcus to revive his fading relevance, or did he truly believe in her son? At home, she worked longer hours, scrubbing floors until her hands ached, just to afford the subway fare to get Marcus to rehearsals. Sleep became a luxury, but she refused to let poverty chain her son's gift. When Marcus asked why she looked so tired, she only smiled, saying, "Some dreams are worth the price." For Marcus, the weight of expectation grew heavier. The more Ethan pushed him, the more he felt the eyes of the world waiting for him to stumble. At night, he lay awake, his fingers twitching on invisible keys, haunted by the thought of failing not only himself but everyone who believed in him. One evening, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, he turned to Ethan, voice trembling. "What if I can't do it? What if they laugh at me?" Ethan knelt beside him, the hardness in his face softening. "Listen to me, Marcus," he said, placing the boy's small hands on the piano. "Music isn't about what you see. It's about what you feel, and you feel more than anyone I've ever met. That's your gift. Don't let fear take it from you." Those words carried Marcus through the following weeks. Together, they refined every detail, the way he bowed to the audience, the way he breathed before the first note, the confidence in his hands. Ethan taught him not only to play but to command a stage, and Marcus, in return, gave Ethan something far greater, a reason to believe again. Finally, the night arrived. Carnegie Hall gleamed brighter than ever, packed to the rafters with critics, donors, and flashing cameras. Backstage, Marcus sat at the piano bench, hands resting lightly on his knees. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths as the muffled roar of the crowd pressed through the walls. Grace stood nearby, her hand clutching his shoulder, whispering prayers under her breath. Ethan paced like a general before battle, every muscle tense with anticipation. The curtains stirred. The announcer's voice boomed. And as Marcus adjusted his posture, waiting for the cue, the boy, who had once been invisible to the world, sat poised at the edge of destiny. The great chandeliers of Carnegie Hall glistened as the audience settled. Into their seats, a sea of silk gowns, polished shoes, and expectant whispers. Tonight was no ordinary concert. It was the charity gala, a night when reputations were measured and the future of careers decided. Ethan Caldwell strode onto the stage, every movement sharp, commanding, his tuxedo gleaming under the lights. The applause rose like a wave, rolling through the hall as he bowed with practiced elegance. Sitting at the piano, he launched into his opening piece, his fingers flying across the keys in a display of speed and precision. The audience leaned forward, mesmerized, each note sparkling like crystal. For decades, Ethan had ruled these keys, and tonight he reminded everyone why he was the master. But then, as the final note of his piece thundered into silence, Ethan did the unthinkable. He rose from the bench, his expression solemn, and turned toward the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying with gravity, "tonight is about more than tradition. Tonight is about the future of music." He extended a hand toward the side of the stage. "I want to introduce someone extraordinary." A ripple of confusion spread through the hall. From the wings, a boy stepped timidly into the light. Marcus. Reed, dressed in a simple suit too big for his small frame, walked slowly, guided by the sound of Ethan's voice and the feel of the polished floor beneath his shoes. Whispers surged instantly. A blind child? Murmurs of disbelief and even laughter drifted through the rows. Some donors exchanged skeptical glances, shaking their heads. This was Carnegie Hall, not a school recital. Grace stood at the edge of the curtain, her hands pressed together, silently urging her son forward. Marcus trembled as he reached the bench. His small fingers brushed the edge of the piano as he sat, his head tilted downward. For a moment, the hall seemed to mock him with its vastness, the weight of thousands of unseen eyes pressing down on his shoulders. He hesitated, his hands hovering just above the keys. Then he turned slightly, as though hearing his mother's heartbeat from the wings. She mouthed the words, "You can do this." Marcus drew in a long breath, and then he began to play. The first notes were soft, tentative, yet pure as morning light. Gradually they swelled, filling the hall with a melody that shimmered with life. His hands moved with both precision and freedom, weaving together fragments of Mozart and Chopin, then folding them seamlessly into something new, his own creation. The music poured out of him not as performance, but as truth. It carried the laughter of his childhood, the sorrow of his struggles, the hope that burned quietly in his soul. It was not perfection by technique alone. It was perfection of heart. The whispers died. the laughter ceased. Every head in the hall turned toward the boy as if drawn by invisible strings. The audience sat frozen, struck silent by the raw beauty unfolding before them. Some leaned forward, mouths parted, eyes glistening. The music swelled higher, then dipped into tender whispers, each note like a confession shared in secret. The hall, built to hold thousands, now felt like the inside of Marcus's soul, intimate and infinite all at once. Grace pressed her hand to her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had always believed her son was special, but never had. She imagined this. Tonight, the world was seeing what she had always known. When the final chord rang out, it lingered in the air like a prayer. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the hall erupted. Thunderous applause exploded from the balconies to the orchestra seats. People rose to their feet, clapping until their hands burned, many wiping tears from their faces. The sound was deafening, a roar of recognition not just of talent, but of something divine. Ethan, standing at the side, closed his eyes. For the first time in his career, he accepted that the future of music did not lie in his own hands, but in the hands of this blind boy who saw more through sound than any man could with sight. He bowed his head, humbled not by defeat, but by revelation. Daniel Harper stood in the shadows, his face flushed red. The words of dismissal he had once thrown out, a parlor trick, a liability, now mocked him instead. Swallowing hard, he muttered, "I was wrong." It was not just admission. It was surrender. Ethan returned to the stage, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Together, they sat at the piano once more. The audience, still on their feet, fell silent as the two began a duet. Ethan's seasoned mastery intertwined with Marcus's raw, transcendent gift. Their music rose and fell like conversation. Two generations speaking through the same instrument, their differences melting into harmony. It was no longer teacher and student. It was equals, bound by something greater than either of them. In the wings, Grace stood tall, her heart swelling with pride. She no longer saw her son as fragile or limited. Tonight he had proven to the world, and to himself, that he was limitless. As the final chord of their duet thundered into eternity, the narrator's voice carried over the ovation. Sometimes, it takes a child with no sight to show the world what it truly means to see.